The auctioneer's gavel had barely struck the podium for the first time when Maude Hart noticed that the man in the back of the crowd had pulled off his leather gloves and tucked them into his vest pocket. And something about that single quiet gesture made her breath catch in a way that no amount of fear or humiliation had managed to accomplish all morning. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a splinter under the fingernail of the American frontier. Dust moved through the main street in slow, amber curtains, and the smell of cattle and wood smoke and something faintly sweet from the bakery on the corner mingled together into the particular perfume of a place that was alive in all its rough and imperfect ways. Caldwell was a cattle town, a railroad town, a town where men came to drink and gamble and start over and sometimes die in the attempt. It was not, by any reasonable measure, the kind of town where a woman stood on the steps of the land office while her deceased husband's debts were settled in public, in front of half the population, on a Tuesday morning in April. And yet that was precisely where Maude Hart stood. She was 26 years old, with dark hair pinned severely at the nape of her neck, and eyes the color of creek water in late summer, somewhere between gray and green, always shifting depending on the light. She was not a delicate woman, not in the way that the illustrated papers like to draw women, with their porcelain cheeks and their helpless expressions. She had spent 5 years on the Kansas plains, and the plains had a way of reshaping people whether they consented to it or not. Her hands were calloused, her jaw was set, and the dress she wore, her best one, a deep burgundy wool that had seen better days, was pressed with such rigid care that it looked like armor. Her husband, Gerald Hart, had died 11 weeks earlier. A fever, the doctor had said, though the whiskey bottles found under the floorboards suggested that Gerald had been assisting the fever along for some time. He had been 34 years old and not a terrible man, not in the way that some men were terrible. He had been, more accurately, a weak man, weak in the way that meant charming in good times and catastrophic in bad ones. He had borrowed money from the First Cattlemen's Bank of Caldwell, and then borrowed more, and then taken out a second arrangement against the land itself. And Maude had known none of this until a man named Hector Plum from the bank had arrived at her door 2 weeks after the funeral with papers she could not read fast enough, and a manner so carefully sympathetic that it made her feel sick. The land and all improvements upon it, including the farmhouse, the barn, the 2 pigs, the kitchen garden, and Maude's own sewing equipment, were to be auctioned for debt recovery. She had been allowed to keep her personal clothing, her mother's Bible, and the small tin of money she had managed to hide in the lining of her winter coat. $22.60. That was what remained of her life in Kansas. She had nobody to call on. Her parents were dead. She had no siblings who had survived past childhood. She had come west with Gerald, who had come west with optimism and not much else, and the life she had built here was the only life she had. So she stood on those steps and she looked out at the crowd that had gathered, because people always gathered for auctions. They were one of the few reliable entertainments available, and she kept her chin level and her hands still at her sides, and she did not cry, because crying in public would give people a story to tell, and she had no desire to become a story. The auctioneer was a narrow man named Cornelius Bates, who wore a hat 2 sizes too large for his head, and conducted all transactions with the same brisk cheerfulness regardless of their nature. He was auctioning off a widow's farm on a Tuesday, and he was precisely as cheerful about it as he would have been auctioning a prize bull at the county fair. Maude had decided, upon meeting him, that she disliked him thoroughly, and that this dislike was one of the few luxuries she could afford. There were perhaps 40 people in the rough semicircle that had gathered before the land office steps. Some were curious passers-by. Some were there out of genuine interest in the property. A few were there, Maude suspected, simply to observe her humiliation, because that was also something people did. There was a man from the neighboring county who had been eyeing the Hart acreage for a year. There were two brothers named Collier who ran cattle on the eastern stretch and were always looking to expand. There was Hector Plum from the bank, standing to one side with his hat against his chest and his expression of practiced sorrow. And there was, at the back of the crowd, a man Maude did not recognize. He was tall, which she noticed first, the way you notice a fence post in a flat field. Not the kind of tall that was gangly or uncertain, but the settled, particular tallness of someone who had grown into their body and made a kind of peace with it. He wore a dark coat, not fine enough for an Eastern lawyer but considerably better than ranch-working clothes, and a hat the color of dry tobacco leaves. He had a broad-shouldered quietness about him, the kind of stillness that reminded Maude less of a man at rest and more of a man paying very close attention. She noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit the pattern of what you're looking at. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't fidgeting or leaning or passing comment with a neighbor. He stood slightly apart from the crowd with his arms at his sides and his eyes. She could see even at that distance that they were dark, very dark, moving over the property documents that Cornelius Bates was reading aloud with a focused, methodical attention. Then Cornelius Bates began the bidding, and everything began to move. The Collier brothers opened at $400. The man from the neighboring county countered. Back and forth they went, the numbers climbing in the grudging increments of men who wanted the land but did not want to overpay for it. A few others dropped out as the price crossed $500. The Collier brothers were persistent. The neighboring county man, whose name Maude thought was something like Aldred, grew increasingly red in the face. Maude watched all of this with the particular detachment that comes from having exhausted your emotional capacity for disaster. She had cried already, alone in the farmhouse in the weeks before this day, and now there was nothing left but a kind of cold clarity that she had chosen to call composure. It was during a pause in the bidding, when Cornelius Bates was theatrically consulting his papers and allowing the tension to build, that Maude looked again toward the back of the crowd. The tall man in the tobacco-colored hat was pulling off his gloves. He did it slowly, deliberately, one finger at a time, the way a man does something when he has decided to do it and has no uncertainty about the decision. Left glove first, then right. He folded them neatly together and tucked them into the breast pocket of his dark coat. Then he flexed his bare hands once, a brief, private gesture as if confirming something to himself, and he looked up. His eyes met hers. Maude did not look away. She did not know why she did not look away. Under ordinary circumstances, she was a practical, private woman who did not make a habit of holding eye contact with strangers at public auctions. But something in the deliberateness of what he had just done, the removing of the gloves, the folding, the tucking away, all of it performed with such quiet intention while everyone else around him was distracted by numbers and competition, had reached through her composure and grabbed hold of something she had not known was still reachable. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to mean something. Then he looked back at Cornelius Bates, raised his bare hand, and named a figure that caused every head in the crowd to turn toward him. $750. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a crowd that has had the wind knocked out of its bidding war. The Collier brothers exchanged a look. Aldred from the neighboring county deflated visibly. Cornelius Bates blinked, which was apparently the most surprise he allowed himself professionally, and then he cleared his throat and called for counters. There were none. The gavel came down. Maude stood on the steps of the land office and watched a man she had never spoken to purchase everything she had built over 5 years in 20 seconds. She was aware that this was, objectively, no different from any other outcome. She was losing the land regardless, and yet something about it felt different. Something about the way he had removed his gloves before he raised his hand felt entirely, inexplicably different. She was still standing there when he came toward her through the dispersing crowd, and she made no effort to move, because she had decided, in the way that a woman who has been stripped of most of her options makes decisions, that she was going to stand still and face whatever came next with whatever she had left. He stopped a few feet from the steps, which put them at approximately eye level. He had a face that was weathered without being old, fine lines around the eyes from squinting into prairie sun, a jaw that had clearly met someone's fist at some point in the past and healed slightly crooked, and a mouth that seemed, in its natural state, disposed toward seriousness rather than smiling. But his eyes, up close, were not as dark as she had thought. They were a deep, warm brown, the brown of river mud in summer, and they were looking at her with an expression she had not expected. He looked of all things careful. "Mrs. Hart," he said. His voice was low and measured with the faint residue of somewhere southern in it, though the accent had been worn down considerably, the way accents were by years of moving through different places. "You have me at a disadvantage," Maude said. Her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. "You know my name and I don't know yours." "Isaiah Bancroft," he said. He removed his hat as he said it briefly, the way men did as a mark of respect, and replaced it. "I run cattle and some horses on a spread about 12 miles south of here." 12 miles south puts you past Denton Creek," Maude said. "That's right. I didn't know there was a working spread down that way." "I've been building it up the past 3 years," he said. "It's not yet what I intend it to be." He paused. "Mrs. Hart, I'd like to speak with you plainly, if that's acceptable." "Mr. Bancroft," Maude said, "I am standing on the steps of the land office having just watched my farm sold for debt, and I have $22.60 to my name. I believe that makes plain speaking not only acceptable but preferable." Something moved across his face at that, brief and complex, and she thought it might have been a form of admiration, though she could not be entirely certain. "Then I'll say it directly," he said. "I didn't come here today intending to buy this property." Maude looked at him steadily. "Then why did you?" "I came because I'd heard about the auction and I thought it was a poor piece of business, a woman being put out this way on account of debts she didn't know about and didn't incur." He said this without heat, as a plain statement of fact. "I didn't have a plan when I came. But when I got here and I saw how things were going, the Collier brothers were going to get it for a song, and then they'd parcel it up and run cattle over whatever you'd built, I decided that wasn't the right outcome." "And what do you intend to do with it?" Maude asked. "The property." "That," he said, "depends considerably on you." Maude was quiet for a moment. Around them the crowd had mostly dispersed, and Cornelius Bates was folding his papers with the brisk efficiency of a man who had another appointment. The dust moved in its slow amber curtains. A horse somewhere on the main street made a complaint about something and then fell silent. "I'm listening," Maude said. "The house and the land are yours to stay in if you want them," Isaiah said. "I have no need of a farmhouse. I have my own place. I bought this to keep it from being broken up and to keep you from being turned out." He met her eyes directly as he said it, which she noticed, because not everyone could say a thing like that and meet your eyes while they said it. "I'm not asking anything in return, I want to be clear about that." Maude studied him. She had been studied often enough in her life to know when she was being told the truth and when she was being told a version of it. He was, as far as she could determine, telling her the actual truth, which was unusual enough in itself. "Why?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, which was itself another unusual thing. Most men asked why they had done something generous, either deflected with false modesty or explained at length. He was quiet for a moment, genuinely weighing it. "My mother," he said finally, "was widowed when I was 9. Lost the house to her husband's debts. There was nobody who stepped in." He paused. "I've thought about that for a long time." Maude looked at him. The dust moved between them. She was aware that she was making a decision, that the situation required a decision, and that her options were limited but not as limited as they had appeared 20 minutes ago. "I appreciate what you've done, Mr. Bancroft," she said, "and I appreciate what you're offering, but I can't live on someone else's charity indefinitely. I need to think about how to make the land work." "That's a sound approach," he said. "I know something about farming. I know something about sewing and mending, and there's a market for that in a town this size." She was thinking aloud, she realized, and stopped herself. "What I'm saying is that I want to find a way to pay you back. We can discuss terms at some point," he said. "Nothing urgent." "I'd prefer it was urgent," she said. "Vague obligations make me uncomfortable." His mouth moved. It was the beginning of a smile, she thought, though it didn't quite arrive. "All right," he said. "Then whenever you're ready to discuss terms, I'll be available. Where would I find you?" "The Broken Wheel Saloon," he said. "Keeps a board where I receive messages. Or you can ride south toward Denton Creek and ask for the Bancroft place. Anyone in the farming settlements out that way knows it." "I'll send a message to the Broken Wheel," Maude said. He nodded, replaced his hat properly, and then did something that she would think about for weeks afterward. He offered her his hand. Not the half-hearted professional handshake that was occasionally extended to women in business contexts, brief and barely committed, but a full, genuine handshake. His bare hand still bare, she noted. The glove still in his pocket, extended to her as an equal. She took it. His grip was firm and warm and brief. "Mrs. Hart," he said. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. He walked away down the main street, and Maude stood on the steps a moment longer, feeling the warmth of his handshake still in her palm. And then she straightened her back and went to find Cornelius Bates to confirm what paperwork she needed to remain in the house. The weeks that followed were both harder and more bearable than Maude had anticipated, which seemed to be the basic operating principle of life on the frontier. The farmhouse was still hers in practical terms. Isaiah Bancroft had registered it properly and left a note via the bank indicating that she should treat it as her own for as long as she needed. This had been communicated through Hector Plum, with an expression of such profound bewilderment that Maude had almost felt sorry for him. She threw herself into work with the focused energy of someone who needed not to think too much. The kitchen garden had survived the winter adequately, and she expanded it, trading labor for seed with a German family named Brower who farmed 2 miles to the east. She established a small sewing enterprise that grew faster than she had expected, because it turned out that Caldwell was full of men who needed shirts repaired and women who needed dresses altered, and nobody currently providing this service with any competence. Within 3 weeks she had more work than she could comfortably manage. She thought about Isaiah Bancroft. She thought about him more than she considered entirely reasonable, given that she had spoken to him for approximately 10 minutes in total. She thought about the gloves, specifically, the way he had removed them before raising his hand. She had seen men bid at auctions before. It was not an uncommon event on the frontier, and she could not recall any of them removing their gloves first. Most men bid with their hands wrapped in leather, a quick, impersonal gesture. He had bared his hand before he made his offer, and there was something in that something about choosing to make skin contact with the gesture, to remove the barrier between himself and what he was doing, that she had not been able to stop turning over in her mind. She sent a message to the Broken Wheel Saloon 6 weeks after the auction. She kept it brief and professional, stating that she was ready to discuss terms of repayment when he found it convenient. 3 days later, a message came back, delivered by a sun-browned boy of about 12, who recited it from memory with the solemnity of someone carrying diplomatic correspondence. Mr. Bancroft would be pleased to meet her at the Miller's restaurant on Thursday at noon, if that suited. Thursday at noon suited. She changed her dress twice before leaving the house, settled on the burgundy wool because it was the best she had and she would not apologize for trying to look presentable, and arrived at Miller's restaurant 7 minutes before noon, which was an embarrassing length of early but also the right kind of early. He was already there. He was sitting at a table near the window with a cup of coffee and a directness of posture that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. He stood when she came in, which was not universal behavior among men in Caldwell and which she noticed accordingly. "Mrs. Hart," he said. "Mr. Bancroft," she said, and sat down. Miller's restaurant was a plain establishment that served plain food competently and made no pretensions otherwise. There were checked cloths on the tables and a smell of bread baking and the distant sound of someone arguing with the cook in the kitchen. The afternoon light came through the window and caught the dust that was always in Caldwell, suspended in the air, and turned it briefly golden. They ordered coffee and the beef stew that was Mrs. Miller's particular accomplishment, and then they spoke about business. Maude had thought carefully about what she wanted to propose. She had calculated, based on current market prices for Kansas farmland, what a fair rental arrangement might look like, and she laid this out clearly and without apology. Isaiah listened to all of it without interrupting. This was another quality she was adding to her accounting of him. He listened the way some people read, with full attention, not already composing his response while she was still speaking. "That's a fair proposal," he said when she had finished. "It's slightly below market rate," she said. "It's fair," he repeated. "I'm not interested in squeezing value out of this arrangement." "I'd rather it be at market rate," Maude said. "I told you I'm uncomfortable with vague charity." "It's not vague charity, it's a discount for a reliable tenant who maintains the property and pays on time." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "I understand your position, but I also get to set the terms for my own property." Maude considered this. It was, she admitted to herself, a reasonable point. "Fine," she said. "We'll document it properly." "Agreed." There was a silence then, the first genuinely comfortable silence she could recall having with someone in quite some time. Outside the window a wagon went by, the driver shouting something cheerful at someone on the boardwalk. A dog barked twice and was quiet. "How is the farm holding up?" Isaiah asked. "Better than I expected for April," she said. "The kitchen garden is doing well, I've expanded it, and I've started taking in sewing work." "I heard that," he said. She looked at him. "You heard that?" "Caldwell isn't large," he said simply. "There was nothing prying in it." "What else have you heard?" He thought about it honestly. "That you work from before sunrise and that you're building a reputation for good, quick work. That the Brower family thinks highly of you. That you've been attending Sunday services at the Methodist church." He paused. "Nothing beyond that." Maude was quiet for a moment. "You pay attention," she said. "I try to. Most people hear things about a widow and what they hear is that she needs managing," Maude said. There was no bitterness in it, just accuracy. "That's their mistake," Isaiah said. She looked at him again, the way she had been periodically looking at him throughout this meal, each time finding something else that was slightly different from what she had expected. He was perhaps 28 or 30, she thought. There were faint lines around his eyes, and the set of his jaw was older than his years, but his eyes themselves were not yet old. "Tell me about your place," she said. "You said you'd been building it up 3 years." He did, and the way he spoke about the land was one of the most illuminating things she had learned about him so far, because of the quality of attention he paid to the landscape of the place. The way the creek curved, the particular grass that grew on the south-facing slope, the 3 cottonwood trees he'd planted himself along the east fence line, was the same quality of attention he had paid to her property documents before the auction and to her proposal across the table today. He paid attention the way other people breathed, automatically, completely, as if it were the basic mechanism by which he understood the world. "It sounds beautiful," she said. "It will be," he said. "It already is some mornings." He walked her back to the livery where she had left her horse, and at the door of it he stopped and turned to her with an expression she was starting to learn to read, the slight tightening around the eyes that meant he was deciding whether to say something. "Would it be unwelcome," he said carefully, "if I were to call at the farm sometime, not for business purposes, just to see how things are going?" Maude looked at him. She was aware of what he was asking and of what she was about to answer, and she was also aware that this was the first time since Gerald had died that any prospect of any kind had felt less like a weight and more like a door. "It wouldn't be unwelcome," she said. He nodded with a gravity that she found unexpectedly charming. "Saturday if the weather holds." "Saturday," she said. He came on Saturday and the weather held. He came on horseback, riding a gray horse that moved beautifully, and he brought nothing except himself and a question about the southwest corner of the fence line, which was a polite fiction they both understood and neither of them addressed directly. He stayed for 2 hours. They walked the perimeter of the property and then sat on the porch steps and drank the coffee she made and talked about Kansas and cattle, and the way the frontier was changing now that the railroad had proper reach. And then he stood up and said it was time he headed back and thanked her for the coffee. The following week he came again. This time they walked along Denton Creek for a while, and she showed him where the wild onions grew, and he showed her from memory the geological explanation for why the creek bent the way it did, which he had apparently learned from a surveyor who had passed through the area 2 years before, and which was interesting enough that she stopped walking to listen to it properly. "You remember a lot of what people tell you," she observed. "Information is useful," he said. "You never know what's going to matter later." What else do you know that might matter later? He thought about it. A fair amount about cattle fever and how it spreads. Some rudimentary doctoring, field surgery specifically. "I can read Spanish, though I speak it poorly. I know how to read weather in the clouds pretty reliably." He paused. "I know that the kitchen garden at your place faces slightly too far east, which is why the afternoon heat is uneven, and that if you put a windbreak of sunflowers along the south edge it would improve the yield." Maude looked at him. "You noticed that from walking the fence line." "I notice things," he said. "You told me you weren't interested in the farm for practical purposes." "I'm not," he said. "I notice things about things I care about." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable silences before it. It was a silence with weight and direction, and both of them were aware of what had just been said and what it signaled, and neither of them moved to immediately address or retreat from it. They stood beside Denton Creek with the water moving cold and quick over the stones and the cottonwood leaves turning their undersides up in the wind, and Maude felt something shift in her chest, the way ground shifts in the first thaw of spring, that particular loosening that is also the beginning of something. "Isaiah," she said, and the first name was a decision, a small one like setting down something you've been carrying. He turned and looked at her. "Maude," he said. She smiled. It was not a particularly large smile, or a particularly practiced one, but it was the first genuine smile that had come to her face without effort in 11 weeks, and she felt the muscles of it all the way up through her cheeks. He looked at her smile like it was something he intended to remember accurately. They rode back to the farmhouse as the afternoon light turned long and golden over the grass, and at the gate he turned his horse and looked back at her. "Next Saturday?" he asked. "Next Saturday," she said. The summer came in fast and hot, the way Kansas summers did, arriving without apology and setting up residence as if it planned to stay forever. Maude's kitchen garden flourished, partly because of her own work and partly because she had, after careful consideration, taken Isaiah's suggestion about the sunflower windbreak, and she found the practical effectiveness of it satisfying in a way that was entirely separate from the fact that it was his suggestion. He came every Saturday, and then also some Wednesday evenings when the light held long enough, and gradually the shape of their time together began to change. It was less the careful negotiation of two people establishing the terms of a friendship, and more the easy, expanding comfort of people who have found that they fit together in ways they had not anticipated. She learned things about him in the way you learn things about someone when you pay attention over time, which was his own method and which she had discovered she shared. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, that his father had died of a chest complaint when Isaiah was 17, that he had spent several years after that working on cattle drives up from Texas before coming to Kansas with savings and a plan. She learned that he read when he could get hold of books, which was not as often as he liked, and that he thought carefully about fairness in the way that men who had experienced the absence of it tended to do. She learned that he had, 3 years before, gone to speak with the sheriff of Caldwell about the Collier brothers, who had a known habit of running their cattle onto smaller farms and denying it, and that the sheriff had been singularly unhelpful, and that Isaiah had subsequently handled the matter himself in a way that involved a direct conversation with both Collier brothers that neither of them had apparently found comfortable. She asked what had been said in that conversation, and he was evasive in the specific way of a man who had been very clear and very firm and would prefer not to be admired for it. She also learned, as the weeks accumulated, that she was falling in love with him. This was not a dramatic revelation, but a gradual one, the slow accumulation of evidence until the conclusion became undeniable. She noticed it first in the way she thought about Saturdays on every other day of the week, and then in the way she found herself listening for horse hooves on the Wednesday evenings when he sometimes came and sometimes didn't, and then in the specific quality of happiness that settled into her when she heard him coming up the lane, a happiness that had both weight and brightness, and was entirely unlike anything she had felt in her marriage to Gerald. She thought about Gerald sometimes, in the honest way that people think about the dead when they are trying to be fair to them. He had not been cruel. He had been, in the final accounting, a man who had not been able to stop himself from destroying what he built, and who had managed to ensure that his self-destruction took someone else down with it. She had grieved him in a complicated, specific way, grieving not what she had lost, but what she had never actually had, the solid and stable thing that a marriage was supposed to be, and that theirs had only approximated. She was thinking about this on a Wednesday evening in late June when she heard hooves in the lane and looked up from her sewing to see Isaiah coming through the last of the daylight, and the specific warmth that moved through her chest was so clear and so complete that she set down the shirt she was mending and looked at it honestly for a moment before standing up to go out and meet him. He had brought her a book. He had gone to the general store in town, and they had had one, a novel by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe, and he had thought she might like it. He said this with the careful, slightly awkward honesty of a man who is uncertain whether he has overstepped. Maude took the book and turned it in her hands and then looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, and then, because the honest, clear thing that had settled into her chest on the porch steps deserved to be met honestly, "You think about me when you're not here." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "I think about you too," she said. The silence between them was different again from any of its previous versions. It was not comfortable or weighted or directional. It was electric in the mild, particular way of a moment that is about to change into something else. He reached out and took the book gently from her hands, set it on the porch railing, and then took her hands in both of his, the same bare hands that had been raised at the auction, and held them with a careful steadiness that was somehow more intimate than anything she had experienced in years. "Maude," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality that she felt in her spine. "I am not a man who says things I don't mean. I'm going to say something now, and I want you to know I've thought about it carefully, and I mean every word of it." "All right," she said. "I came to that auction because I thought it was unjust," he said. "That's true. But I stayed, in the weeks after I stayed because of you. Not because of any duty or any situation. Because of you specifically. Because of the way you stood on those steps and held your chin up and didn't give anyone in that crowd the satisfaction of your fear, even though you were afraid. I know you were afraid." He paused. "Because of the way you set terms at the restaurant instead of accepting charity. Because of the way you explained the wild onion and where it grew and what you used it for, as if the information mattered." Another pause, longer this time. "Because every time I come here I find that I am better in some way for having been here, and I have not felt that way in a very long time." Maude looked at him. Her hands were warm in his. The evening light was doing that particular Kansas thing where it turns everything gold just before it goes, as if apologizing for leaving. "Isaiah," she said. "I know it hasn't been long," he said. "And I know it hasn't been easy for you. I'm not asking for anything immediately. I just wanted you to know that my intentions toward you are serious, and that I would like, if you're willing, to court you properly." "How do you intend to court me properly?" she asked. "I'll keep coming on Saturdays," he said. And Wednesdays when I can. I'll bring things you'd like if I can figure out what those are. I'll tell you the truth when you ask me things and when you don't ask me." He thought for a moment. "And eventually, if things go the way I hope they go, I'll ask you a question that you're under no obligation to say yes to." Maude was quiet for a long moment. Overhead the first stars were appearing, the way they did in Kansas, suddenly and all at once, as if they'd been there all along just waiting for the light to stop drowning them out. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am already considerably farther along than the beginning of a courtship." He looked at her. "I think I've been in love with you since the afternoon by the creek," she said, "when you told me you notice things about things you care about." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "Then I've been in love with you since the auction steps, since the way you shook my hand." She tilted her face up toward him, and he leaned in slowly, carefully, with all the intentionality of everything he did. And when he kissed her it was warm and certain and not brief. And the Kansas evening wrapped around them and the stars came out overhead, and the creek somewhere in the distance ran on over its stones, and the cottonwood leaves turned in the wind. The summer deepened and the courtship was, as it turned out, the kind of courtship that moved at the pace of two people who had already established their fundamental understanding and were simply enjoying the shape of what it felt like to be chosen. He brought books when he found them. She fed him properly, because he was, she had discovered, a man who worked too hard and ate too little, and this was a thing she was able to address. He helped her with the fence line, and with the heavy work in the barn, without making it into anything other than two people working together, which was its own form of respect that she valued. They talked for hours, about everything and about nothing, about the injustices baked into the frontier economy, the way the railroads extracted profit from the smaller farmers, the way women had no legal standing to protect themselves from exactly the situation she had found herself in with Gerald's debts, the way the land that was being so enthusiastically claimed had been someone else's home before. Isaiah had strong views about these things and expressed them plainly, and she found that her own views, which she had always held carefully and privately as a woman without much room for public opinion, were drawn out and sharpened by the quality of his attention and his own clarity. He talked about the broader injustices with the direct simplicity of someone who had seen the edges of them. He had worked with Mexican vaqueros on the cattle drives, and had watched the contempt with which Anglo bosses treated men who were faster and more skilled than they were, simply because of where they had been born and what language they spoke. He had ridden through land that 10 years earlier had belonged to the Cheyenne and Arapaho, and seen what treaty-breaking looked like in its practical application, and this had left a particular mark on his moral landscape that Maude recognized and respected. "You have a sense of justice that's not abstract," she said to him one evening. "Abstract justice doesn't do much for people who need the actual kind," he said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." The trouble, when it came from the direction of the Collier brothers, who had apparently not forgotten or forgiven the auction, and who harbored the additional grievance of their previous confrontation with Isaiah over the cattle encroachment. In late July, Maude came out one morning to find that the fence along the northern edge of the property had been damaged, 3 posts broken and the wire pulled back, and that the kitchen garden had been trampled, apparently by cattle that had come in overnight. She was furious in the cold, practical way of someone who has invested weeks of labor into something and seen it destroyed. She assessed the damage, made note of which plants could be salvaged and which could not, and then she sent a message to Isaiah at the broken wheel. He arrived by mid-morning with a look on his face that she was coming to understand as his serious face, the expression that meant his attention had fully gathered itself around a problem. "I'm going to speak to them," he said. "The sheriff won't do anything," Maude said. "He didn't do anything before." "I'm not going to the sheriff," Isaiah said. "He went to the Collier brothers that afternoon." Maude did not ask exactly what was said, and he did not volunteer the details, But when he came back in the evening, the fence was repaired. The Collier brothers had apparently also brought tools, and there was an understanding in place that she suspected was built on something more concrete than goodwill. "What did you tell them?" she asked. He sat down on the porch steps and accepted the coffee she handed him. "I told them that the property is mine legally, that any further interference with it constitutes a crime, and that I would pursue legal remedies with specific documentation of all past incidents." He paused. "I also told them that I was keeping a record of the previous cattle incident, and that if they were uncooperative this time, I'd be having a conversation with their largest creditor, who is a man in Wichita whose business practices don't hold up particularly well to close examination." Maude looked at him. "You know their creditor's business practices?" "I pay attention," he said. She sat down beside him on the steps. "That's finished, then?" "I believe so," he said. She reached out and put her hand over his quietly, without announcement, and they sat together on the porch steps while the evening came in, and the repaired fence cast long shadows in the last of the light. "I'd like you to come and see the place," he said after a while. "The spread. I'd like you to see it." "I'd like that too," she said. He took her the following Saturday, and the 12 miles south to the Bancroft spread were, as it turned out, some of the most beautiful 12 miles in Kansas, which was saying something because Kansas had a wild, particular beauty that people who had never seen it tended to underestimate. The creek came into view, and then the land opened up into the broad, grass-covered slope she had heard described but had not been able to fully imagine, and the house at the center of it was a solid, unpretentious thing, built of wood and stone with a porch that wrapped around two sides, and the 3 cottonwood trees along the east fence line standing straight and young in the morning air. "You planted those yourself," she said. "3 years ago." He looked at them with a quiet satisfaction. "There'll be proper shade trees in another 5. She walked through the house with him, and it was a good house, built by someone who thought about the relationship between a space and the people who lived in it. The rooms were plain but well-proportioned, the windows placed to catch the morning light and the evening breeze, the kitchen arranged practically. It was not yet fully a home. It was a house where a single man lived carefully, but the bones of something better were visible in every room. "It needs things," he said, watching her look. "It needs someone to live in it properly," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Is that something you could imagine?" he said. She turned and looked at him, there in the kitchen of his house with the morning light coming through the window and the cottonwood trees visible beyond the glass and the sound of his horses moving in the paddock outside. "Yes," she said, "it's something I could imagine." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and cupped her face in his hands, those bare, careful hands, and kissed her with a depth of feeling that was quiet and enormous at the same time. The way the land outside was quiet and enormous, containing everything without announcing it. "Marry me," he said. "Yes," she said immediately, without the pause that polite convention would have suggested was appropriate. She had been waiting for this question since the moment she had understood that she loved him, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "Yes, Isaiah, that's what I want." He looked at her with those dark, warm eyes, and there was, in his expression, something she had not quite seen in it before. Something that was relief and happiness and wonder all at once, the expression of a man who has been very careful not to hope for something, and is now confronting the fact that he has received it anyway. He held her for a long time in the kitchen of that house, her head against his shoulder, his hand in her hair, the Kansas morning moving around them, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. They were married in September, at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, on a Saturday afternoon when the prairie light was at its most generous, that particular amber autumn quality that made everything it touched look like it was in the process of being remembered. The church was small and the ceremony was simple, because that was what both of them wanted. The Brower family came, the German farming family Maude had traded labor with, all 7 of them filling an entire pew and looking scrubbed and official. Hector Plum from the bank came, which surprised her. though she supposed he had some investment in knowing how the situation had resolved. A number of Isaiah's neighbors from the farming settlement south of town came as well, solid, practical people who regarded both of them with the combination of approval and mild curiosity that was the frontier's version of warmth. The pastor read the words and they said the words back, and when it was done and they were standing in the pale gold afternoon outside the church, with the guests moving around them and someone's child attempting to catch a chicken that had appeared from somewhere inexplicable, Isaiah took both her hands in his and looked at her with the total, focused attention that was so essentially him that she had come to think of it as its own kind of declaration. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. This time he smiled completely, not the beginning of a smile that she had seen at the land office steps, but the full and genuine thing, and it transformed his serious face into something younger and brighter and utterly, privately his. She had seen it a handful of times over the summer and she had hoarded each instance. And now, she smiled back with her whole face, and he laughed quietly and pulled her close and pressed his lips to her hair. They left the farmhouse, her farmhouse, Gerald's farmhouse, the farmhouse that Isaiah had purchased to keep from being broken up, in the practical care of the Brower family's eldest daughter, Clara, who was 17 and capable, and wanted to earn money for a passage east to where her aunt lived. The arrangement was good for everyone. Clara would live in the house, tend the kitchen garden, and receive the income from the sewing enterprise for the duration, and Isaiah would continue to hold the property as an investment. It was a thoroughly sensible arrangement, and it satisfied Maude's requirement that nothing be wasted. She moved her things to the Bancroft spread the week after the wedding, and the process of making it genuinely into a home began. This was a project that she approached with the same methodical engagement she brought to everything, and it was also, she discovered, one of the most satisfying things she had done since coming to Kansas. The rooms that had been adequate became something warmer. Curtains appeared at the windows. The kitchen was reorganized according to a logic that Isaiah surveyed carefully, and then agreed made more sense than his previous arrangement, with the directness of a man willing to concede a good point. She put things in the house that were hers, her mother's Bible on the shelf in the sitting room, a small watercolor painting that her aunt had done of a lake in Ohio that she had always kept wrapped in cloth, because there had never been a right place to hang it before, and now there was, in the hallway where the morning light caught it. These were small acts, but they accumulated into something, the way small acts of settlement did, and gradually the house became a thing that belonged to both of them equally. What she had not anticipated, though she supposed she should have, was how much she would enjoy simply being in the same space as him at the end of a day. They had each lived alone, both of them accustomed to the specific quiet of solitude, and neither had been certain how the adjustment would feel. What it felt like in practice was this. He would come in from the paddock or from riding the fence line, and she would be sewing or cooking or reading, and he would wash his hands at the basin and come and sit with her and say something about what he had seen out there. A hawk, a particular color in the clouds, a problem with the east fence that he was turning over in his mind, and she would respond or ask a question or simply listen, and the exchange was so easy and so naturally calibrated to what they were both like that she found herself amazed, on a fairly regular basis, that this was the life she was in. The fall was good, the cattle were healthy. Her sewing work continued through the mail, because it turned out that several women in Caldwell preferred to send their alterations by horse rather than make the trip themselves, and this gave her a steady income that she kept carefully in her own accounting, because it mattered to her to contribute concretely to the economy of the household. She also began, in the quiet evenings, to manage the financial records for the spread, a task that had been done adequately but not well under Isaiah's previous system, which consisted largely of memory and occasional notes on whatever paper was near to hand. She organized them into a proper ledger, with columns and categories and a running account of the season's income and expenses, and presented it to him one evening with a directness that he received with appreciation rather than the defensive surprise she had privately been prepared for. "You're good at this," he said, going through the columns. "I'm good at most things I pay attention to," she said. He looked up with that near smile. "I believe that entirely." They spent evenings reading, separately and sometimes aloud to each other, and she discovered that this was its own particular intimacy, the sharing of a story, the way their responses sometimes aligned and sometimes diverged in ways that were interesting to understand. He read quickly and remembered everything. She read slowly and thought carefully and had opinions that she did not soften. He valued this about her, the way he valued her general refusal to soften things for the sake of social comfort, and she felt the value he placed on it in the way he engaged with her ideas, directly and fully, as if they were worth the engagement, which was the most fundamental form of respect she knew. The winter came and enclosed them in the good, particular way of frontier winters, where the world shrinks down to the size of what you can see from your own porch, and the people inside the house become everything. Isaiah was a good man to be enclosed with. He was steady in the way that some people were steady, not the performed steadiness of someone suppressing something, but the natural, rooted steadiness of someone who had made their peace with themselves and with the specific life they were living. He did not drink, which Maude had noted early and appreciated for reasons she did not need to explain. He was neither sullen nor falsely cheerful, holding to an honest middle that she found restful. On a night in December, when the snow had closed down the world outside to a white silence and the fire in the sitting room was the entire world, they sat together in the good warmth of it, and she said something she had been thinking about for weeks. "Gerald never knew what I thought about things," she said. Isaiah looked up from his book. "I mean that he never asked," she said, "not in a cruel way." "He was not a cruel man. It never occurred to him that I might have thoughts worth knowing." Isaiah was quiet for a moment, holding what she had said. "That sounds like a very long 5 years," he said. "It was," she said. "It had good parts, but that part was very long." She paused. "I'm saying this because I want you to know that the way you are with me, the way you ask and then actually listen, I don't take it for granted. I know what it is. I know what it isn't." He set down his book and looked at her with that full, direct attention that was still capable of catching her off guard even after months. "You never have to take it for granted," he said. "I'll keep being interested in what you think because I am genuinely and perpetually interested in what you think. That's not a policy. It's just true." She moved closer to him on the settee, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat with the fire and the snow outside and the good silence of two people who have nothing to hide from each other. In February, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, because she was a practical woman and important information was best conveyed practically, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that were, in their order and their intensity, among the most moving things she had witnessed. Surprise first, genuine and complete. Then something that moved through him that she could only describe as illumination, a brightening from within. Then he stood up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in his hands and said her name, just her name, Maude, in a voice that had lost all its usual steadiness. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "A little sick in the mornings, but nothing severe." He pulled her close against his chest and she could feel the hammer of his heart. "Maude," he said again. "You said that already," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I'll probably say it a few more times." She laughed, and his arms tightened around her, and outside the February prairie was beginning its first tentative motion toward spring. The spring of 1879 arrived, and with it the resumption of the world. Maude worked the kitchen garden with the adjusted methodology that her changing body required, which she accepted with the same practical equanimity she brought to most things. Isaiah watched her with a care that she received without too much protest, since she had come to understand that his care was not the patronizing kind that assumed she couldn't manage herself, but the genuine kind that wanted to know if she needed something and would provide it without drama. In March, news came that the Collier brothers had sold their property and moved on. Maude heard this from the Brower family, who were pleased about it. Isaiah heard it from his own network of information and confirmed it. The eastern stretch of land was purchased by a homesteader family named Tolliver who had come down from Nebraska, and who turned out to be good neighbors in the quiet, dependable way that good neighbors tended to be. Clara Brower, who had been managing the farmhouse, sent word in April that she had decided to accept her aunt's offer in Cincinnati after all, and would be leaving in June. This raised the question of what to do with the farmhouse, and Maude and Isaiah spent several evenings discussing it. They considered selling it, renting it to a new tenant, letting it stand empty. They settled finally on renting it to a family newly arrived from Indiana named Mac Lester, who needed temporary accommodation while they built on their own land purchased to the north. The arrangement was good and practical, and Maude had Clara supervise the transition with characteristic efficiency. The summer was long and golden and generous in the way that Kansas summers occasionally were, as if apologizing for their more difficult years. Isaiah's cattle were in good condition. The horses, he had expanded the horse operation, which Maude had observed in the ledgers and endorsed, as the demand for good horses in the growing cattle economy was clear, and the margins were better, were doing particularly well, and he had begun a relationship with a buyer in Abilene that was proving profitable. Maude's sewing work had expanded into something that now required genuine management. She had taken on a second woman, a widow named Agnes Pierce, who had arrived in Caldwell with 3 children and more skill than circumstances. And together, they were handling a volume of work that had moved beyond casual enterprise into something closer to a small business. She discussed this with Isaiah with the same direct clarity she brought to the household finances, and he listened and asked good questions, and suggested that she might consider approaching the dry goods merchant in town about a formal arrangement for fabric supply at reduced rates, which was a business relationship she had not thought to formalize, and which, when she did formalize it, saved her considerable money. He was her partner in everything, she realized. Not in the way that phrase was used as a compliment, but in its actual meaning. He brought his full attention and his full honesty to their shared life, and she brought hers, and the result was something that was stronger and better than either of them would have been separately. Their son was born in August, in a summer heat that was particularly emphatic, delivered by a midwife from Caldwell named Alma Greer, who was competent and unflappable, and who Maude had engaged months in advance with characteristic forethought. Isaiah was in the house throughout, which was not customary. Most men were directed firmly away, but Maude had given him the option and he had chosen to stay, which she had expected. The baby was a boy with Isaiah's dark eyes and Maude's jaw, which she found objectively amusing, and they named him Henry, for no particularly weighty reason except that it was a solid name that fit the sound of the family they were. Isaiah held Henry for the first time with the same careful, total attention that he brought to everything, and the expression on his face as he looked at his son was one that Maude stored away in the same place she kept the day at the creek, and the moment with the gloves, and the morning in the kitchen when he had come around the table to take her face in his hands. These were her inventory of him, the moments that defined what this was. "He looks like you," Isaiah said. "He has your eyes." "He'll be trouble," Isaiah said with the near smile. "Undoubtedly," Maude agreed. Henry was a decisive baby, clear about what he wanted and unhappy about delays in receiving it, which Maude found she recognized. He grew at the pace that strong babies grew, with a purposefulness about it that felt characteristic. Isaiah adapted to fatherhood with the same directness he brought to everything, practically and without ceremony, learning what the baby needed and providing it without being asked, which was, she suspected, going to be the kind of father he was. They settled into the rhythm of a family, which was a different rhythm from the rhythm of a couple, more complex and more demanding, and also, she found, more fully inhabited. The house had its routines and its sounds, and the particular quality of warmth that a house with a baby develops, all of it anchored by the underlying steadiness of the two people at the center of it. Her sewing enterprise continued to grow. By the following spring, she had 3 women working under a loose but effective arrangement, and the business was generating a reliable income that she managed with the ledger discipline she had already established. She was considering, in the way that a practical woman considers things carefully before deciding, whether there was a next step that made sense, something more formal, a dedicated workspace in town perhaps. She brought it to Isaiah one evening, and he listened and then said, with characteristic directness, that it seemed like a sound idea and that the space above the hardware store had been vacant for 6 months and might be available at reasonable rates, and that he knew the hardware store owner well enough to introduce her. She looked at him across the kitchen table. "You already thought about this," she said. "I noticed it was the direction things were going," he said. "I pay attention." "You pay attention to things you care about," she said. "Yes," he said, "I do." She leaned across the table and kissed him, in the kitchen in the evening, while Henry slept in the next room, with the prairie outside and the 3 cottonwood trees in the east fence line that were beginning to become proper shade trees, and the whole solid, real, chosen life around them. The workspace above the hardware store came through in the summer of 1880, a practical arrangement with reasonable rates as Isaiah had predicted, and Maude established the Hart sewing establishment there, using her original name because it was already known for quality and because it was hers. The name gave her a particular, private satisfaction. She had not lost herself in the transition from Hart to Bancroft. She had simply added to herself, as a good life adds to you rather than subtracting. Agnes Pierce, who had steadied into the role of chief seamstress, ran the daily operation with an efficiency that freed Maude to handle the business management, the supplier relationships, the customer negotiations. She was good at this, better than she had known she would be, and the discovery of competence in an area you hadn't previously explored was one of the quiet pleasures of a life that kept offering new things. Isaiah's horse operation had expanded to the point where he was supplying several of the larger cattle operations in the region, and his relationship with the Abilene buyer had grown into something substantial. He had added 2 more hands to the spread, good men who he paid properly and treated fairly, and there was a quiet humming quality to the place now, the sound of a thing that is running well. Henry began walking in the fall of his first year, and into his second, developed a personality that was recognizable in equal parts from each of them, the focused attention and the determined chin, and a stubbornness that was entirely his own, and that both his parents regarded with the combination of exasperation and pride that was apparently the correct emotional response. One evening in the fall of 1880, when Henry was asleep and the house was quiet and the fire was going in the sitting room, Isaiah brought Maude a cup of tea and sat down beside her with the air of a man who has been thinking about something. "What is it?" she said. "I want to expand the east pasture," he said. "There's a question of whether to buy the adjacent parcel that Harker's been trying to sell, or whether to use that money toward the new horse barn I've been planning." Maude considered it. "What does the east pasture expansion give you? Capacity for about 30 more head. And the horse barn? Better conditions, better prices. The quality horses command considerably more than the cattle in current markets." "Then the horse barn," she said. "The market you've built for quality horses is a better return on investment than expanding the cattle herd at this point." He looked at her. "I had the same conclusion, but I wanted to think it through with you." "I know," she said. "That's why you brought it to me." He smiled. "That's why I brought it to me," he agreed. She leaned against him and picked up her book, and he picked up his, and they read together in the firelight and the comfortable silence of 2 people who are, in the fullest sense of the word, home. The following spring Maude told him she was expecting again, and his response was, gratifyingly, very similar to the first time, the same sequence of expressions, the same coming around the table, the same saying of her name in that unsteady voice. She had not been certain it would be the same, since repetition was the enemy of wonder, but it was exactly the same, which told her something important and true about him. This time it was a girl. They named her Clara, for no reason more complex than that it was a name Maude had always liked, and that Clara Brower had served them well and deserved a small tribute. Clara Bancroft arrived in April of 1881 with a great deal of energy and immediate opinions about everything, which her parents received as fitting. Henry was nearly 2, and regarded his sister with the cautious, serious attention of a child who is not yet certain what to make of a development, but is prepared to reserve judgment. Within a month, he had decided she was interesting, and within 2 months, he was following her progress with the proprietary air of someone who considers supervision part of his responsibilities. Life on the spread had the quality that Maude had not known to look for when she had come to Kansas 5 years before, the quality of being genuinely built. Not borrowed or approximate or held together with hope and insufficient planning, but built from good materials by people who knew what they were doing, and why they were doing it, and who they were building it for. She thought, sometimes, about the woman who had stood on the land office steps with $22.60 and her chin level. She thought about her with a kind of tenderness, the way you think about someone who has survived something. That woman had been right to be frightened and right not to show it, and she had been, under the circumstances, remarkably open to the single possibility that had arrived in the form of a tall man in a tobacco-colored hat who had pulled off his gloves before raising his hand. That openness had been the luckiest thing about her. Everything else had been work, good work, the kind of work that pays. She was thinking about this on a Saturday afternoon in the summer of 1881, a year and more into the life that had grown from that single, clear gesture at the auction, sitting on the porch of the Bancroft spread with Henry playing in the dirt at her feet, and Clara asleep in the cradle Isaiah had made himself over the winter, carved from cottonwood because of the trees he had planted himself, and because that seemed right. Isaiah came out from the barn and crossed the yard with the long, settled stride she knew better now than she knew her own footsteps, and he came up onto the porch and looked at the children and then at her, and the look on his face was the one she had been storing all along, added to now by everything that had come after, expanded and deepened by what they had built and what they were. He sat down beside her and she handed him a glass of water from the pitcher she had brought out, and he drank it and set it down, and then he said, quietly, as if they were in the middle of a conversation they had been having for some time rather than at the beginning of one, "I've been thinking about the fence line along the north pasture." "The northeast corner?" she asked. "No, the whole north stretch. It needs replacing," she said. "I noticed it last week when I rode out with Henry." He looked at her. "When did you start riding that way?" "I go out most Thursdays," she said. "I like to see how things are looking." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you're riding my fence lines." "Our fence lines," she said. He looked at her with those dark, warm eyes that were the first thing she'd noticed up close and were still, 2.5 years later, the most consistently arresting thing she'd ever seen. "Our fence lines," he agreed. Henry looked up from the dirt and said something with great conviction that was not yet quite a word, and they both looked at him, and then at each other, and the afternoon light was doing its particular Kansas golden thing, turning everything warm and permanent looking, and the 3 cottonwood trees in the east fence line moved in the gentle wind that came from the north most afternoons in summer, and Isaiah took her hand and held it, his bare hand around hers, and it was everything. She thought of the auction again. She thought of the moment before she had known what he would do, before the gloves had come off, when she had still been standing in that crowd of strangers facing the straightforward disaster of her situation. She thought of the specific way the gesture had moved her, not the purchasing of the land, not even the offer he had made on the steps afterward, but the act itself, the deliberate, unhurried removing of the gloves before he raised his hand to bid, the choosing to be unguarded before he made his offer. She had made her decision in that moment, she realized. Not the decision of who to marry or who to trust, or who to spend her life with. Those decisions had come later, through the slow accumulation of evidence that was how she made good decisions. But a smaller, preceding decision, the decision to be open, the decision to be capable of receiving something. She had been so armored on those steps, so deliberately composed, and then she had seen that gesture and something had loosened in her armor, and she had thought, this one is different, this one is worth looking at more carefully. And she had been right. She had been right in the way that the best decisions are right, not because they worked out perfectly, which life did not do, but because they were made from the clearest, most honest place available at the time, by a person who was paying full attention and trusting what she saw. She was still paying attention. He was still showing her things worth seeing. Their children were loud and quiet and growing by the minute. The fence lines needed attending to. The ledgers were in order. The sewing establishment was turning a decent profit. The horse barn was going up nicely and would be finished before winter. Agnes Pierce had told her last week that she was considering taking on a fifth seamstress, which was a good problem to have. The toll of her family from Nebraska had become genuinely good neighbors, and Maude suspected their eldest son was developing an interest in Clara Brower's younger sister Ruth, which was its own small story in progress. The Brower patriarch had told Isaiah that he thought this particular stretch of Kansas was going to be good land for the next generation, which was the highest form of optimism available from a German farmer, and was, in its way, a very fine thing to be told. Henry fell over in the dirt and looked at it with the serious assessment of someone determining whether the fall merited protest, concluded it did not, and returned to whatever he had been doing. Clara made a small sound in her sleep and then was quiet. Isaiah's thumb moved across the back of Maude's hand in the unconscious way of someone accustomed to the presence of another person, the thoughtless, profound habit of love. The Kansas afternoon moved around them, warm and enormous and full of its own kind of grace, and the life they had built sat solid and real and entirely theirs in the middle of it. And Maude Hart, who was Maude Bancroft, who was the woman who had stood on those steps with her chin level and $22.60, and the whole vast difficulty of the frontier ahead of her, leaned into her husband's shoulder and felt, completely, without reservation, without the particular anxiety of things not yet resolved, that everything was exactly as it should be, not because the world was simple or fair or without its complications. The world remained, as it had always been, thoroughly itself impractical and occasionally unjust, and full of fence lines that needed replacing and creditors who showed up at doors and auctions that reduced human lives to line items in a ledger. The world remained the wild, rough, imperfect, magnificent thing it was. But within it, here in this particular place, this particular afternoon, this particular life that had been built board by board and day by day from a gesture at an auction, a man taking off his gloves before he raised his hand, as if to say, I am doing this without armor, I am doing this with my whole self. There was something that was simple and fair and without complication. Love, she thought. That was the word for it. Still the best word, still the most exact. She turned her face toward him, and he was already looking at her because he was always paying attention, and she smiled at him with her whole face, and he smiled back with all of his, and Henry said something incomprehensible but emphatic in the dirt, and Clara slept in her cottonwood cradle, and the afternoon went on in its golden Kansas way, and there was nothing left unresolved and nothing left to want.